I think it would be really fun for people first to just get a little bit more of a sense of you and your background. So you wear two hats as a social scientist and a diplomat.
Three
Um,
hats,
Three
actually.
hats.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I want to hear about all the hats. Can you tell us how that came to be?
Um, I wear three hats. I am a social scientist. I'm a political scientist. My area of research and study and teaching when I was teaching was political and social change, development, so the move to cities was very natural. So social science, cities, and I became a diplomat. I was ambassador to the United Nations and later on became the Singapore's ambassador to Washington. Since coming home, I'm still an ambassador half-time. I'm at a university half-time. I run the Lee Kuan Yew Centre for Innovative Cities. I try to do some research as well. And I'm also chairman of the National Arts Council. So I have three great portfolios: cities, foreign policy, and the arts. And in this generation, young people don't have a career. They have a portfolio of jobs, and I'm right there.
I love the portfolio. So can we stay on you for just a minute?
Yes.
I think you've been a little modest, and I'm going to look down to read to make sure because I don't want to miss anything. You've had many firsts in all those positions as well, in addition to the portfolio. First woman head of the NUS Political Science Department, first director of the Institute of Policy Studies, first woman permanent representative to the United Nations, first director of the Singapore International Foundation. And how would you say these experiences have shaped your perspective?
I do different things, and I would encourage, especially the younger members in the audience, to try to do different things in your career. There was a study recently by an academic, an American educationist from OSU, Ohio State University, and one from the James Madison University. And they advocated that students who did two major studies, were much more innovative and creative than students that did one major. So if you do two jobs, you are more creative and innovative. If you do three, it's even better if you do four, and so on and so forth. But I think it does, because it forces you to think differently and you pull things together. At least I find I do that naturally. There's carry-over knowledge from one field to the other. But more importantly, as you work, research, and study and act, you find the networks you build in one area are networks you can carry to the other area. And that really, works very well together.
I think this is a great sort of build on what we've been hearing today. We've been hearing a bit about multiplier effects, I'm going to call them. Maybe that's not the right term. But for instance, cities as,
Right.
Bringing lots of people together with lots of different types of activities that they have. They're the sort of crucibles of creation. And I just, turning back to that topic of sustainability in cities, we've just heard a lot about different perspectives on who's doing what. Can I ask you, who among the countries is doing a really good job? I mean, obviously we've just learned about amazing things that are going on in Singapore and some others, and what are maybe some of the commonalities of them being able to do a good job in sustainability or not being able to do a good job?
Marguerite, I've asked myself, why do some countries get it, or some cities get it, and some don't? And I think some cities and countries get it because it's necessity, it's existential. You've heard a lot about Singapore. It's an existential reason. I look at the Scandinavians, and they've always intrigued me. They always get it right, first in the class, top 3 in every ranking, and especially on sustainability. And you have to ask yourself why. And I think it is because of necessity. It's existential. I mean, it's extremely cold in the Scandinavian countries. Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark a little warmer perhaps. And there's just expanse of wilderness in those places. So they really have to come together. And I've been reading up on Scandinavians because I'm interested in community life, why people do behavior, why they do what they do. And social relations are very important in these communities. When it's so cold and you're just there at night, you're huddled in the same place, you know, so social relations is very strong. They're also very pragmatic, you know, and they have to deal with the cold. So they think sustainability. And they do very well on the happiness index too, because they are socially a great community. And so I'd like to create some of that. I hope we create some of that in Singapore. So that's at one level. The necessity, existential reasons force you to be sustainable. And so you work at it. And Finland has done quite a bit, you know. I was looking at a Yale Centre study on, they've ranked Finland tops, and they have actually a map of indicators. They are like KPIs, and bureaucrats look at it, decision makers look at it, businesses look at it. Every 4 years they renew it. So they measure themselves. But the other reason why countries get it is because of crises. I think many of you would have seen Netflix, The Crown. You know, Winston Churchill got it with the Great London Fog. At first, he said, oh, it's just a fog, it'll go away, it'll go away. Well, it didn't go away, this fog. And, you know, people died, thousands died. I saw a figure of 4,000. But then you had the Clean Air Act in Great Britain. That's 1952, the smog, and then 1956, Clean Air Act. And Britain has renewed that act, you know. China is now getting it, and is a bit of that epiphany also, like Britain. I think it happened in 2014 when they had this great severe smog in Beijing, which just caused this great break, you know. And Xi Jinping in the 19th Party Congress that happened, you know, last year, in fact had a whole chapter on environment, a whole section on environment. And I couldn't believe it, you know, the statement. A Chinese president said, what is it now? Humans must obey, must observe, must respect. Human beings must respect nature and obey the laws of nature. Any damage we inflict on nature will come back to haunt us eventually. I mean, that's a great statement, you know. And I think I understand now they've strengthened enforcement, they've, you know, sent pollution inspectors out to the countryside. So China's getting it because I think the legitimacy of the Communist Party's rule depends on their ability to deliver a good environment, food safety, lead poisoning is killing people in areas. So the Chinese have become very sustainable and very conscious of being sustainable and conscious of the environment. And I think they're now sort of taking some of the lead in climate change, which with the departure of the United States, I shouldn't say departure, with the announcement of the United States to leave the Paris Agreement, that has created a bit of the vacuum.
Yeah, I think these are very interesting and useful thoughts. So this idea of a sense of urgency, essentially even of crisis, a level.
Oh, I should add also,
go ahead.
We've been battling with the the haze from Indonesia. In 2015, it was really a very bad haze in the region, and it did just hit Singapore and Malaysia. It hit Brunei, Thailand, Cambodia. It just went around the region. And President Jokowi, did a very good thing, to his credit. He went out to the areas. He saw the devastation in Sumatra, and people died. Some people died. So now Indonesia is working at it, and I think they're stepping up to work on controlling the haze pollution. and dealing with the oil palm companies.
Yeah. I mean, so I'd like to follow on with this. Obviously, a sense of crisis or urgency and seeing people in pain or even dying can be a useful spur. But why, what about regulatory, actions or pressures? Why is it sometimes just so hard for some countries, and I'll look, mine as an example now, to incorporate research into their thinking and evidence-based into their thinking?
Oh, regulatory procedure. Why is it so hard to incorporate research in decision, in planning?
In planning, why?
Let me begin by being critical of ourselves, the academics. I think we have to produce results or produce research that can be usable. First, it has to be usable, it has to be policy relevant. I often say to my colleagues in the Lee Kuan Yew Centre for Innovative Cities and in SUTD that when we come out with the research results, we have to be careful that it's not, something that's not applicable. So I think we've got to find that kind of research. But there are always strong interests in a country, and interest can stop regulation from being implemented or the right regulation fashioned. Now, Singapore is introducing a carbon tax. We announced it this year. Next year, we will have a carbon tax. I know there was a lot of trepidation in business, amongst business people before that, so it took us a while to sort of get this together. And I think there was a lot of consultation with business. Now everybody is on board, so it'll come on next year. So if you say, why is it so difficult for regulations to be brought out, the right regulations? Some countries have very deep interests that can stand in the way, powerful interests in the way of regulation. And then you've got, and I know countries have an economy to run, they have to feed people. So I think we have to bear that in mind too.
Yeah, I guess one possible solution would be, the bottom-up approach of getting people, in the public excited, so they put pressure back on those interests, perhaps.
I think yes, that would be one. But, I'm a political scientist, I'm a diplomat, so I get both sides of the picture. Governments have to create jobs, and they have to get the economy going. They've got to get it right on sustainability too. You hope you never have to really make the choice. But sometimes, some choice is necessary, or you have to slow down that progress. And I think these are the realities that politicians have to make, even if they get it and they want to do the right thing.
Well, while we're on the topic of politicians, and you'd raised the Paris Agreement, I wonder what you're possibly expecting there. What can we expect to see?
We wouldn't be really discussing the Paris Agreement if the United States, if President Donald Trump did not last year, I think it was in June, shortly after he came in, make the announcement, which he promised he would make, that he would take the United States out of the Paris Agreement. But let me quickly add here that the United States is still, at the moment, in the Paris Agreement, because you cannot pull out of the Paris Agreement. No state party can withdraw from the Paris Agreement before the agreement has entered into force for 3 years. Now, the Paris Agreement entered into force in 2016. So it is only in 2019 that the United States can actually withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And it takes effect only in 2020. But I think it's in time for President Trump to go to the electorate to say, I told you I would pull out, and I pulled out before the 2020 election. But it's, it's not good news, because the United States is the largest economy in the world, is the second largest carbon emitter in the world. And it promised to pay $3 billion to the climate fund, and it's paid up $1 billion, there's $2 billion short. So how do you persuade? I think developing countries were going to sign up because they felt that they would be getting some assistance to fulfill the goals. So that's one of the problems. But, you know, the good news is that COP24 will be happening. Poland is going to host it. And even though President Trump has said he's going to pull out, I think some 160 million Americans from cities and states and businesses are committed to fulfill those goals. I think if the United States does not show up as a state party to the COPs, all the other people can go and attend the meetings. And they can go, but they're not state parties. But I think it will carry on. Macron has held his One Planet Summit this year, and different countries are hosting also the climate summit. So the conversation goes on.
So I'm glad that's a great segue actually to my next question for you. So where nations sometimes fail, we turn to cities to look for progress, you know, to get us there for the future. Cities are often thought of as leaders or agents of change in sustainability spheres. I wonder, first of all, do you agree with that? And, you know, if you do, how can cities do a better job?
You know, we heard a lot about that earlier on, and the deputy mayor, was it from Melbourne? He's made a very ambitious statement. He says nation states, they stall, they don't have a strategic vision, but cities can have a strategic vision. That surprised me, because mayors have to go through elections too, just like politicians. And actually, I learned through another project I did that Latin American mayors in some Latin American cities can only run for one term. It's 4 years. So they can come back again, but it cannot be a second consecutive term. So I thought, how do you have a vision if it's just 4 years? So that's a problem. But I think if you look at cities which have been successful and implemented plans and strategic plans, they are cities with mayors who've been there a long time. Richard Daley, Chicago. Michael Bloomberg in New York. Mayor Park Won-soon, who Seoul just won the Lee Kuan Yew City Prize. He's into his 3rd term. And I think Los Angeles has a lot, mayor's been there quite a long while. So, and Singapore is very successful because you see continuity of strategic plans. It's the same government, you know. So I think there's something to be said about continuity. Now, is the city the place for the strategic plan, or nations? I think they go through the same blockage of the election. So, you know, you are as strategic as 4 years, I guess, you know. But it is true that cities, mayors, they are agents of change. They act fast. It's where the shoe pinches. The citizens come up and tell them they have to deliver. So they are good agents, especially if you are in a country where there's gridlock in government. But there are limits also to what cities can do. So as a political scientist, I will say cities cannot sign free trade agreements. And if your country has sanctions, sanctions on another country, you can't conduct business. And I think cities in the United States found that out when, is this used? This is not good. But cities in the United States found out that when they tried to do business with, some of them tried to do business with Myanmar. They found it very difficult because, you know, the United States sanctioned Myanmar.
Right, I can imagine. And by the way, I'm going to come to everybody in the audience to give you a chance to ask questions too in a minute. I can imagine that cities' power to make change is not infinite, and their size is not infinite. And of course, they do have to obey national rules. But you actually wrote an essay for us at Scientific American about recommendations you would make to help cities be more successful, and you had a couple of really kind of nice, clear-cut pieces of advice, which I'd I'd love it if you would share.
I was asked to write a piece like a curtain raiser or make it relevant for the World City Summit. So my piece was on what can cities do to be sustainable, and I had 3 recommendations. One is to have a vision or a plan of action. And I was so glad to hear all the mayors and the leaders all saying that you need a vision. Secondly, I said you need an institutional and legal framework, and they also said that. You know, you need the laws. You need the laws ready there to help you facilitate. And that includes creating a bureaucracy also, you know. And thirdly, I thought peer-to-peer learning was extremely important. You have C40 today. In fact, I'm looking at this idea that there's something called urban diplomacy, that cities help cities. Cities create networks. So I have a new category called urban diplomacy. And I think that will help cities sort of become better cities, and they can learn from each other.
I like this idea of urban diplomacy. Could I invite anybody in the audience, if you'd like? Now, I can ask questions all day, but if you'd like to ask them yourself, please. And please let us know who you are.
Thank you. My name's Mark Thomas. I'm originally from New Zealand. I lead a smart cities consulting business, but we've been in Singapore now for 18 months, working in China and Malaysia. I've got 2 questions. The first is, as we know, in the period from 1950 to 2050, the relative population of North America will halve, and the relative population of Asia will double. And of course, in economic terms, it'll be even more significant. China will double its GDP in the period 2010 to 2020. I just wonder if we don't get a bit preoccupied with the present dramas of the US. In New Zealand, you know, we televised The Hobbit, we did the movies, and you recall in one of those movies, the elves, their time on Earth came to an end and they sailed off, ironically, to the east. I just wonder, without being too pessimistic, if the time of America, in fact, is not dissipating, and we're consumed by the present dramas, but if, in fact, if we take a 100-year view, we know age is rising, and some of these sustainability challenges that we wrestle with, in fact, actually with that big change in world dynamic, will present both different opportunities, different challenges, but also different solutions.
I didn't hear much of it because
the feedback.
Your microphone was
Sure.
too close. Can you just give me the question?
Sure. So really, it's the preoccupation we have currently with the US, I think, in the context of the growing rise of Asia. So the US and Canada will halve in population terms in 100 years. Asia will double, and the economy, in fact, will grow even more. So I just wonder if our preoccupation with the US and its withdrawal from multilateralism maybe doesn't take enough of a sense of the perspective of what's coming. And so Asia will grow, become more significant in terms of sustainability, both as a challenge and as a solution provider. So it's your perspective, I suppose, on these changes and whether we don't get a bit too carried away with Trump sometimes.
Asia is dynamic, Asia is growing, and Asia can stretch from Japan to Afghanistan. Some people will put it at Iran as well. And at the UN, it goes to Turkey, you know, the definition of Asia. So I've always thought that actually the biggest challenge of this century is the growth of China. I think it will be India as well. That's sort of sleeping, but it is going to be as big a challenge as China. We just haven't focused on it. And the task of this century is to try to help the world understand and embrace and accept the rise of China and India. In other words, big Asian countries that become big powers, and they will consume a lot and the resources. But you can't stop them. Now, they can learn to be more sustainable, you know, as the developed countries are also having to learn to be sustainable. But it is there. So, unfortunately, this is going to be the dynamics of the coming foreign relations.
in your opinion, how do we avoid people just saying sustainability for the sake of it? And is there any examples that, is there any distraction to this kind of discussion when people talk about sustainability and stuff like that? So,
how do we, sustainability
how do we
is
avoid,
overused.
yes, how do we avoid overusing sustainability and render it into something quite meaningless, in my opinion?
Yes, I think I understand your question. You feel the word sustainability is overused. How can we, in fact, make the meaning more real and that people will observe it and embrace it? Is that your question? Yes, thank you. Unfortunately, sustainability has been used again and again. And you can be desensitized when it's overused. But I imagine that when you see, and today we're in the world of social media, we're in the world of internet, you will see real-time pictures of what is happening to the world. Whether there's drought, whether there is flooding, the Arctic's melting. So I think that will give you a sense that it's real, that the world is changing. And if we don't do something about it, it's not a good place to live. And you've been recently we've been seeing in the newspapers, a sea of plastic. We are throwing all this plastic into the sea, the consuming of plastic bottles, plastic bags, etc., waste management, yeah? Now, doesn't that sort of put the chills in you and make you realize that sustainability is a real thing and it's not just a word? So, and it's going to affect your food chain, it's not plastic, but weather changing and so on, global warming. I think sustainability has come to hit us. Today, people say that they have a sense that there's some ground feel, that there's movement on the ground, that people are getting it. Those who go to the climate change conference say that years ago, it was just a formality. Many countries are not getting so agitated. But today, they are feeling it is there. And there is ground up movement everywhere. Citizens want to do it. And they are getting a sense that they've got to contribute to sustainability. So I think, I'm not so pessimistic. I don't think it's overused. I think people are getting it. Images are helping us get it. And the conversations are all over, starting. And especially amongst young people, there is a great sense about what's going to happen because they will be alive when the world is not so hospitable.
Hi, so actually somewhat on a similar note as to the previous question. Mine is predominantly centered around the vernacular that we use and the terms of engagement that we use to talk about sustainability and the related issues. Because as you have mentioned, there are indeed this burgeoning sense of involvement both from, let's say, ground up communities as well as from top political food chains. But I think the reality of the matter is that even amongst conventional society, these are still somewhat minor fractions. These are very significant to future development, but there are still kind of minor pockets that occur in our populations. So I would like to ask on how do you feel that such issues can be better communicated in ways that do not rely on our traditional narratives of, let's say, our great literature or even, let's say, our conference proceedings. How do you feel we can better report, and on which sorts of media can we better employ practical solutions from the ground up? Thank you.
I'm going to take that the question to be, how do you best communicate to people that it is urgent and necessary to be sustainable. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. It would help if you all would stand because the sound, the acoustics is terrible. Yeah. How would we best communicate? If the government or a city is committed to green growth, to sustainability, it helps. Because you can have public education on public broadcasting to, teach, but teach in a very engaging way through documentaries. What is sustainable? I think it is time we tried to put into our school curriculum something on environment and sustainability. Not enough schools, not enough education systems embrace that. But I think that should be part of the preparation towards sustainability. How else would you communicate? I think citizens, each citizen group, NGOs, some are more effective than others. You can do that. You can do films, but sometimes they are a bit boring, and a bit preachy. It cannot come across that way. So I cannot now think of a good environmental film. But maybe people in the audience can think of that. Can you think of a very powerful environmental film that caused you to rethink? And that is how I would convey the message.
Hello, Nick Campbell from Nature Research. So I wanted to pick up on the point, the relative roles of cities and countries that you were highlighting before. And also, it was interesting for me seeing the last panel session where we were talking about a very interesting examination of Singapore as a living laboratory and how ideal and collaborative the whole situation was there. And it struck me that maybe does Singapore benefit from being both city and country, and therefore is the great approach that Singapore is doing, how applicable is that to, say, a similar sized city in China, because where they have to consider provincial governments and central governments as well as their municipal governments?
You are right. Singapore is a city and a state. We're a city-state. And so it's double whammy. You have all the powers of a country and you can bring it to bear on organizing, planning, and managing the city. Can this be copied? Is the model exportable? People have been coming to Singapore to say, can we learn from you? Teach us. I am a bit more modest. I tend to say that maybe we are sui generis. We are, our model is to our own. But I think cities can take ideas and adopt and adapt those ideas for themselves. I think the most teachable thing is that as someone who does development, and I do development studies, I always said, because Japan made it as the first Asian industrialized country, you had the 4 tigers or the 4 dragons following, so it's that flying geese. If Africa had one very successful development country, others will follow because you get inspired. So if Singapore can, through our city management, inspire others, they can follow. China cannot, copy everything. It's very different. The problems is the scale is different, And in that sense, when the Chinese come to us and say, can you teach us, we really scratch our heads. And what we've done is we did the Suzhou project for them. This is building a little Singapore park, industrial park. But we taught software and hardware. We built it, but what was more important was the software, which is planning, making contracts, you know, and making the contracts reliable and predictable and honoring the contracts. So I think cities can learn, but they really have to adapt what they learn. And if they are city-states like Singapore, they really, you know, find it's very helpful to have the power of the city. But now mayors are all saying what they have to do is so enormous and the tasks are so great, they want to be further empowered. Mayors complain that cities are not sufficiently empowered, and that's another debate.
I think this would be a wonderful debate to have, but unfortunately we're just about out of time. So I want to thank you again so much, Heng Chee, and maybe you'll be able to stay a little bit, because in a few minutes we'll have the reception and people can come and speak with you more.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary.